Madam President.
The senior senator from Wisconsin.
Junior.
Oh, junior.
Madam President.
Thanks for the correction.
As if in legislative session and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 1318, the Women's Suffrage National Monument Location Act, which was received from the House and is at the desk.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 1318, an act to authorize the location of a monument on the National Mall to commemorate and honor the women's suffrage movement and the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent.
Is there objection to the measure? Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time.
Without objection.
I know of no further debate on the bill.
If there is no further debate, the question is on passage of the bill. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The bill is passed.
I ask unanimous consent that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to speak to the Women's Suffrage National Monument Location Act to designate the Women's Suffrage National Monument be built on the National Mall. I was proud to introduce this bill with Senator Blackburn, as she and I represent both the first and the final states to ratify the 19th Amendment and grant women the right to vote across the nation. The National Mall honors some of the most important features of our shared American story. Conspicuously absent from this portrayal of our nation's history, however, is the story of women's suffrage. In fact, the National Mall receives over 24 million visitors annually, and despite there being 40 commemorative works on the National Mall, none of those are dedicated to women. We have introduced this legislation to correct this glaring omission on the National Mall. Women's suffrage was only made possible through the fight of multiple generations of activists of all backgrounds who joined together with the steadfast belief that our country must live up to its highest democratic ideals. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, where they declared that all men and women are created equal. Sojourner Truth gave her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech in 1851, where she challenged the women's suffrage movement to include black women. Susan B. Anthony was arrested in 1872 for violating the law and daring to cast her vote at the ballot box, and went on to help found the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890. Carrie Chapman Catt, born in Ripon, Wisconsin, took up the helm of that organization after Anthony and traveled around the country organizing for the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Inez Milholland led on horseback more than 8,000 marchers in the 1913 women's suffrage procession down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell demanded that the movement include women of color by refusing to march at the back of that very demonstration. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns led acts of peaceful civil disobedience, including silent sentinels who picketed at the White House continuously from 1917 to 1919. There are countless other women who fought and continue to fight for true equality for women in this country. Without the story of how women fought to secure our rightful participation in our democracy, our National Mall is incomplete. This monument is just as much about honoring our past as it is about inspiring our future. Every young girl, every child, every adult who travels to our nation's capital should see themselves reflected there. They should know that they belong in the halls of government and their stories belong in our nation's history, and that they belong on the National Mall. And with that, I would yield to the senior senator from Tennessee, Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam President. And I thank my colleague for her wonderful work on this issue. And since 2020, we have worked to recognize that 100-year celebration of women achieving the right to vote and to tell these stories. As she said, her state was the first. Tennessee was the 36th state. And our colleagues who have read about the War of the Roses and that summer of 1920, when suffragists descended on the Capitol in Nashville, and those that were for suffrage wore a yellow rose. Those that were antis, as they were called, wore a red rose. And Carrie Chapman Catt and Ann Dallas Dudley and Ida B. Wells led this fight. And what a fight it was. And finally, they pushed forward with the 36th state granting ratification. So the histories in our states are rich on this issue. And we want all Americans to appreciate the work that went into women gaining that right to vote. Now, my colleague mentioned that there were 40 monuments, memorials, statues, and historic sites on the mall. Not a single one of these 40 are specific to women. 22 are dedicated to individual men. 10 to military history and veterans. 3 to foreign relations. 2 to private organizations. 1 to U.S. postal history, and 1 to the history of the U.S. canals, and 1 to the history of horses. Now, all of these have found their way onto the mall, and what we have done is to work with the Park Service, find a place that would be perfect. The mall's Constitution Gardens. It's a 50-acre space dedicated during our nation's bicentennial as a living memorial to the founding of the Republic. And in this garden, it is appropriate that we recognize the work of women to help preserve the freedoms and the liberties that we have here in this nation. So I thank my colleagues for passing this legislation. The House passed it unanimously last year. So it is appropriate that as we finish and complete this 118th Congress, that we set aside time and that we pass this legislation to recognize the work, the powerful work of women who gave so much of their life to support freedom, liberty, and voting rights. Thank you, Madam President.